day, everyone, and thank you for joining the Humor Book Launch Seminar. Please note that this session is being recorded here onto Zoom and is being live streamed on our Facebook page. This is one of our other seminars, which you can find listed on our website. We also have a Twitter page, which is at humor_Africa. For security reasons and to ensure a safe Zoom meeting, we ask that you rename yourself using your full name so that we easily identify you. My name is Minenhle Ncube, and I am a doctoral fellow at HUMA, and I will convene this meeting. The HUMA Book Launch is a forum of acknowledgement and critical engagement of work being produced in and on the African continent, particularly relevant to HUMA's research agenda. It provides a space for critical engagement, discussion of selected books with an audience and panel of experts working in similar fields. Today, we have the immense pleasure of having Professor Camilla Hawthorne, who is an associate professor of sociology and critical race and ethnic studies at the University of California in Santa Cruz. Her work focuses on Black geographies and the racial politics of migration and citizenship. She is a co-editor of the Black Mediterranean, Bodies, Borders and Citizenship, published by Palgrave in 2021. She's also the author of a monograph, Contesting Race and Citizenship, Youth Politics in the Black Mediterranean, the topic of this seminar, published by Cornell University Press this year. She is a past chair of Black Geography's specialty group of the American Association of Geographers, and she also sits on several editorial boards for some journals. Her discussant today is Ms. Alison Kwa, who is an anthropology doctoral research fellow at HUMA at UCT. Her research at HUMA examines the intergenerational transmission of artisanal skills within the context of AI and technological transformations in Mthatha in South Africa and Akita in Japan. Ms. Kwa holds a BA in anthropology from Tufts University, an MA in practical anthropology from the University of Cape Town, whose research was on African immigrant youth and civic participation in Cape Town. Ms. Kwa has worked and conducted research in Singapore, Argentina, the United States, and South Africa. Congratulations, Professor Hawthorne, on this publication, and thank you for joining us with Ms. Kwa to engage on this work. Professor, you can start perhaps and speak about it, and we can have an engagement from Ms. Kwa, and later we'll have a question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If you could just give me one moment, we've been having some really terrible storms out here in Santa Cruz, which I think is affecting my internet connection. So I'm trying to connect to my router with an Ethernet cable. So let me just get that set up so that I can ensure that that my connection will be stable during my talk. Thank you.
That's okay. Apologies, everyone. Professor's just still fixing her internet connection, but she will be joining us shortly. Thank you.
Oh, it says internet connection is up.
Thank you. Just let us know if we can start.
Hi, are you able to see me and hear me?
Yes, yes, I can.
Okay. All right. Well, I think I'm ready to go. If thank you for bearing with me. Like I said, we've had
Thank
maybe
you.
5 days of just nonstop rain, which I guess in California is not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, I'm going to share my screen, and you can all see my screen.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you all for your patience, and thank you for having me here today for this book launch. It's really an honor. My name is Camilla Hawthorne, and the core of my work involves archival and ethnographic research on the Black diaspora in Italy, with an emphasis on emergent forms of Black Italian political mobilizations. My scholarship seeks to map the geographical and historical specificities of racial formation in Italy, Southern Europe, and the Mediterranean basin, especially for all the ways that they challenge US-centric understandings of racism and race. I also take up the question of what it means to engage with Italy, not just as a site of bounded comparison with North America, but also as a starting point for a relational and transnationally interconnected theorization of global racisms. In other words, my work asks how the politics of Blackness might shift if we geographically reorient the global history of racial capitalist modernity on the Italian peninsula and the broader Mediterranean region. I argued that this history reveals the inextricability of border fortification, coloniality, and anti-Black racism, and that as such, immigrants' rights and post-colonial struggles must necessarily be part of the global resistance to resurgent racism and fascism. So before I move on, just a little bit about how I came to this work, because this book really emerges from my own lived experiences, and the ways that I think about the relationship between my life and my research is grounded in Black feminist praxis. The idea that we're always knowing from somewhere, and that the spatiality of our knowing can be a generative starting point from which to theorize. So my mother, who in the left photo is sitting kind of in the front facing toward the camera, is a white Italian who grew up in the small town of Trescore in the region of Lombardy in Italy near Milan. My father, who's sitting next to her and also is holding me in the photo on the right, is a Black American who was born in rural Virginia and grew up in Oakland, California. My parents met when my father was drafted into the US Army at a moment when the US government had not ended the draft, but they had stopped sending drafted men to Vietnam. So my father was sent to Italy instead. They married in 1976, and then several years later, they returned to California, where I was born. So I grew up in a bilingual household, and I actually spoke Italian before I started speaking English. And since my mother was the youngest of 13 siblings, and she was the only one in her family to leave Italy, I grew up spending every summer and often winter with my Italian family. This is all to say that my life has been shaped by a deep connection to both diasporic Blackness and diasporic Italianness. And because my white Italian grandfather fought in the Italian colonial wars in Libya, I'm connected to both the transatlantic slave trade on my father's side and the history of Italian colonialism on my mother's side. So over the course of my research, I was struck by the resonances between the stories of Black Italians in Italy and my own lived experiences, and their insights helped me understand my family in new ways. But at the same time, our Italian Blacknesses, in the plural, didn't always map onto each other perfectly, right? I have the privileges of relatively unfettered transnational mobility that come with an American passport and a US academic institutional affiliation. And I have Italian citizenship thanks to the same descent-based citizenship framework that disenfranchises so many of my friends and comrades within Italy. Despite the fact that I was born in California and they were born in Italy, I am an Italian citizen simply because my mother was also an Italian citizen, which is just another example of this mutual imbrication of race, gender, kinship, and citizenship. And so these resonances and dissonances between my experiences of Black Italianness and those of my interlocutors became the basis for a number of collaborations that we developed within Italy, and within and outside the formal academy. So in 2021, I published the edited volume, The Black Mediterranean, Bodies, Borders, and Citizenship with Palgrave Macmillan. And that project emerged from a collaboration called the Black Mediterranean Collective, which is a transnational and interdisciplinary group of scholars studying racism, colonialism, Blackness, and the politics of migration and citizenship in Italy. The book considers what a careful attention to anti-Black racism and colonial legacies discloses about the Mediterranean refugee crisis. And we came to this because we found that those themes had been largely neglected in mainstream coverage of what was happening in the Mediterranean Sea, particularly between 2015 and 2016. And this represented the first book published in the field of Black Mediterranean studies. And my new book, which I'm here to talk with you all about today, Contesting Race and Citizenship, focuses on the movement to reform Italian citizenship law and provide a path to citizenship for nearly 1 million youth of color who were born and raised in Italy. I ask why and how Black Italian activists have taken up national citizenship as a key terrain of struggle over racism in Italy, and what new forms of differentiation and exclusion might be emerging in these efforts to reformulate and expand citizenship law. So in the book, I explore the political possibilities and limitations of citizenship, but I also think about the ways that Black Italians are building diasporic communities beyond the nation state. So I'll start with a short excerpt from the book, and then I'll finish by talking a little bit about what has changed since the book came out this past summer. On October 7th, 2013, the Italian Prime Minister Enrico Letta declared a national day of mourning. Just 4 days earlier, a 20-meter fishing boat carrying over 500 Eritrean, Somali, Ghanaian, and Syrian asylum seekers from Libya caught fire and capsized just 1 kilometer off the coast of the Italian island of Lampedusa, which is geographically closer to the African continent than it is to Italy. While all the bodies of the victims were never recovered, by October 11th, it was estimated that the death toll had reached at least 359 people, making this shipwreck the deadliest maritime disaster in the Mediterranean Sea since World War II. The spectacle of hundreds of coffins lined up in seemingly endless rows inside a Lampedusa airplane hangar came to symbolize the incalculable scale of violence that was being reproduced daily as migrants attempted to traverse the maritime borders of Europe in the Mediterranean Sea, or as commentators increasingly began to call it, the Mediterranean graveyard. In response to the tragedy, Letta publicly declared during that October 7th commemoration that all those who had perished in the shipwreck while attempting to reach Italy were, in his words, Italian citizens as of today. Yet, while the dead were awarded posthumous citizenship, what of the 155 asylum seekers who were rescued? They were investigated for illegal entry, which under the 2009 Security Set Amendment to Italy's immigration law is regarded as a criminal offense. The survivors were shunted into overcrowded detention centers and faced deportation to their countries of origin, all while the European Union unveiled new plans for a high-tech surveillance system that would track migrant boats in the Mediterranean. And in cities and towns across Italy, the children of immigrants who were born and raised in Italy were also being legally barred from Italian citizenship due to a restrictive nationality law that links citizenship to blood descent. In fact, one of the most prominent citizenship reform mobilizations unfolding in Europe today is the movement to reform Italian nationality law. Italy has among the most restrictive citizenship laws in Europe. Italian nationality is conferred on the basis of jus sanguinis, or right of blood, which has left unrecognized and disenfranchised as many as 900,000 children of immigrants who were born and raised in Italy. This is therefore the place from which my book begins. Contesting Race and Citizenship asks why and how so many Black Italians have adopted national citizenship as a privileged terrain of struggle over racial justice, inclusion, and belonging in Italy. In the book, I argue that citizenship, and specifically the long-standing debates about the legal inclusion of Black subjects within European polities, is key to understanding the connection between subtler, late 20th century colorblind or cultural racisms and the resurgence of overt racial nationalisms during the last decade. After all, in the wake of World War II, after the horrors of fascism and the subsequent international campaigns to challenge the supposed myth of race, racism and racial nationalism did not simply disappear. Instead, I argue they were re-embedded within the seemingly race-neutral apparatus of national citizenship. But rather than asking whether citizenship is good and just, as the highest legal principle or a path to rights and inclusion, or bad and unjust, as an apparatus of racial exclusion or a form of liberal accommodationism, in this book, I'm more interested in the work that citizenship does. National citizenship is a powerful yet often overlooked crucible within which racisms are being reproduced and reconfigured, new racial distinctions are articulated, and the constitutive exclusions of liberalism are laid bare. The new Black Italian politics points to the many contradictions at the heart of citizenship and of the liberal project itself. Is it possible to mobilize for rights and recognition without reproducing the racial state? If citizenship represents how the idea of inclusion also produces exclusion, then what new forms of differentiation might be emerging through efforts to expand Italian citizenship? Does activism that engages with the racial state's language have the potential to radically reformulate the state's categories from within? To answer these questions, in my book, I trace not only mobilizations for national citizenship, but also the more capacious transnational Black diasporic possibilities that emerge at those moments when activists confront the ethical and political limits of citizenship as a means for securing meaningful, lasting racial justice. Formations that are centered on shared critiques of the racial state, as well as shared histories of racial capitalism and colonialism. So how did citizenship become such an important terrain of contestation over racism in Italy? While a range of fields has attempted to comprehend the social, political, and cultural dynamics of national citizenship, I found as I was writing my book that the answer to this question remains surprisingly elusive in the theory and literature on citizenship. And indeed, the strategic importance of national citizenship for Black Italians seeking to challenge biologically determined notions of Italianness pointed to some limitations in contemporary citizenship theory. So, the liberal sociology of citizenship has focused on citizenship primarily as a legal contract between the state and the individual that produces access to formal rights. By contrast, the literature in critical citizenship studies tends to focus on dynamics of inclusion, exclusion, and differentiation. But while the interventions of critical citizenship studies represent a powerful reimagining of citizenship by focusing on forms of insurgent citizenship from below, I found that race was often peripheral to these analyses, and the ongoing sovereignty of the state was downplayed in favor of transgressive, non-national acts of citizenship. The field of Black studies, on the other hand, has taken on the relationship between citizenship and racism through an analysis of Blackness's position within liberal understandings of rights, subjectivity, and political agency. As Orlando Patterson famously argued, racialized chattel slavery represented social death, predicated on the preclusion of the right to natality. And for this reason, in the US context, newly emancipated Black Americans mobilized for citizenship through claims to birthright that ultimately culminated in the passage of the 14th Amendment. In contemporary accounts, primarily those focused on the United States, scholars emphasize the persistent condition of second-class citizenship for Black people living in the afterlives of slavery. But in a different geographical context, Black European studies has instead emphasized a normative claim, specifically the normative claim that Black people in Europe should be recognized as national citizens rather than as migrants. This, of course, is an intellectual and political project meant to contest the idea that Black people are eternally Europe's outsiders, that they are perpetual migrants and newcomers, regardless of how long and for how many generations their communities have been firmly established in Europe, and regardless of the ways that their expropriated land and labor were central to the development of European nation states. But when these North American and Black European studies approaches to citizenship are put into direct conversation with each other, what can inevitably emerge is a sort of teleology of Black politics across the diaspora that looks something like this. First, we focus on achieving national citizenship. Then we can begin to question how the very categories of the liberal state are shot through with racism and anti-Blackness in ways that preclude the realization of substantive citizenship. But this very linear story didn't square with my experiences in Italy. I instead found that Black politics had taken on a range of divergent rather than cumulative forms, in which Black immigrants, refugees, and second-generation Black Italians were articulating distinct political goals and very different kinds of relationships to citizenship. For Black people born and raised in Italy, citizenship became a means of obtaining rights. For newly arrived refugees, it functioned as a strategy of racial filtering and exclusion on behalf of the state. In a 2019 Instagram post, the Italian-Ghanaian writer, curator, and medical student Theophilus Marboa highlighted what is at stake in Black Italian struggles for recognition through this very clever remixing of a James Baldwin quote from Notes of a Native Son. Baldwin writes, "For the history of the American Negro is unique in this, that the question of his humanity and of his rights, therefore, as a human being, became a burning one for several generations of Americans, so burning a question that it ultimately became one of those used to divide the nation." Theo wrote, "For the history of the Black Italian is unique and also in this, that the question of his citizenship and of his rights, therefore, as a citizen, became a burning one for several legislatures, so burning a question that it ultimately became one of those used to divide the nation." Marboa's reformulation is especially poignant because the original text is an excerpt from Stranger in the Village, an essay Baldwin wrote about his experiences in Switzerland, in a snowbound alpine town just about 4 hours from Milan, Italy. Baldwin describes his experiences in a place where no Black man had ever set foot, on a continent where the Black man as a man did not exist, except as an abstraction geographically bounded to Europe's colonies. For Baldwin, this observation is what distinguishes Europe from the United States, where even as a slave, the Black man was an inescapable part of the general social fabric, and no American could escape having an attitude toward him. Marboa's engagement thus provides a subtle yet loving disruption of the comparison at the heart of Stranger in the Village. Marboa suggests that Blackness has long been central to Italian understandings of citizenship, and indeed that it is precisely the invisibilization of Black people in Europe that has systematically externalized them as foreign to European nation states. By linking Baldwin's analysis of rights, humanness, and Blackness to the Italian context, Marboa also helps us see how citizen in Italy effectively functions as a racial proxy for the category of human. In these ongoing struggles for citizenship, Black activists have made use of shifting alliances and tactical engagements with the state for purposes that may exclude, but also extend beyond the objective of nation-state recognition. Their relationship to citizenship is continually in motion. Black Italians alternatively accept the terms of nation-state citizenship and sometimes reject them outright. They also stretch the discourses and practices of citizenship in the sense of Fanon's stretching of Marxian analysis to the colonial context. And they swerve citizenship, engaging strategically with it on the terrains of law, cultural politics, and political economy, while simultaneously decentering it as the apex of anti-racist struggle. The complexities of Black Italian citizenship struggles demand that we move away from any generalized notion of Blackness and its relationship to citizenship. After all, the Black diaspora in Italy includes refugees, asylum seekers, first-generation migrants, and foreign university students. It spans multiple generations, some of whom have direct ties to Italy's former colonies, and some who have been in Italy since the 1960s. It includes people who were born in Italy and individuals with a range of citizenship and immigration statuses. For this reason, scholars have increasingly turned to the Black Mediterranean as an analytical framework for understanding the geographical and historical specificities of Blackness in Italy and the wider Mediterranean region. This work explicitly draws on and extends Paul Gilroy's powerful theorizations of the Black Atlantic by asking how Blackness is constructed, lived, and transformed in a region that has been alternatively understood as a cultural crossroads at the heart of European civilization, a source of dangerous racial contamination, and more recently, as the deadliest border crossing in the world. Since the origins of the Italian nation-state, the process of constructing the ever-shifting boundaries of Italian citizenship has been bound up with notions of Blackness, Mediterraneanness, and the production of space. Following the project of Italian national unification, which lasted from 1848 until the incorporation of Rome as Italy's capital in 1871, citizenship was defined in relation to both Southern Italians and Africans. The consolidation of the geobody of Italy out of a patchwork collection of city-states and empires into a nation-state was intertwined with processes of internal colonialism. Southern Italy was understood by Northern Italian elites through an Orientalist lens of cultural and civilizational inferiority due to its perceived proximity to the African continent. This is what was called the Southern Question. This racial mapping must also be understood as a response to Northern European racial theorists' dismissal of the Italian peninsula as a site of racially impure, degenerated Mediterraneans. Italy's precarious national racial identity was also shaped in relation to its trans-Mediterranean empire building on the African continent, which was unfolding alongside national unification. And multiple spatially extended diasporas, from the mass exodus of Italian immigrants after Italian unification to the large-scale arrival of African migrants in the 80s and 90s, have contributed both to the redefinitions of citizenship and the legal frameworks governing Italianness. Therefore, Black Italian struggles over citizenship today are shaped by a long global history of spatial contestation over the racial borders of Italianness in relation to Europe, Africa, and the Mediterranean. While the political framework of the Black Mediterranean helps us ground Black Italian politics in historical and geographical specificity, the Black Mediterranean is also not just a claim to an incommensurable difference or exceptionalism that sets Italy apart from the rest of the world. Rather, drawing on insights from the field of Black geographies, supposedly marginal sites are actually relational spaces that offer profound insights about the workings of power and the organization of the modern world. In this sense, then, Italy is also a place from which to theorize race, citizenship, and Blackness on a global scale. After all, if we take Cedric Robinson at his word, the origins of racial capitalism actually lie in the Mediterranean, which served as a laboratory of sorts for the technologies of dispossession and exploitation that were then exported to the Atlantic. And today, some of the most powerful mobilizations against border fortification, state racism, and coloniality are taking place across the Mediterranean. The duality of the Black Mediterranean as a site of both racist subordination and innovative resistance reflects the many contradictions at the heart of the Mediterranean itself as a symbolic and material space. The Black Mediterranean is thus a site where many different forces have converged in ways that complicate linear understandings of politics and solidarity. It is a place where racism, xenophobia, and colonialism cannot be separated into distinct analytical silos. For this reason, the Black Mediterranean is also a political or ethical demand, one that calls for transgressive forms of solidarity that can actively subvert state categories like migrant, citizen, and refugee. These are ethical demands based not on abstract humanisms, nor on biological or blunt kinship ties, but rather on the shared histories of racist injustice and Black struggle across the Mediterranean, from colonialism to Fortress Europe. And so, as I said, now I'd like to say, before I conclude, just a few words about what has happened since I finished writing the book, because so much has changed. So I conducted the research for Contesting Race and Citizenship between 2012 and 2019. When I first set out to understand a new generation of Black political activism in Italy, I was immersed in debates about the language of collective identification. The language of Black or Afro-Italianness was new, tentative, and emergent, and many of the young organizers I interviewed in the early days of this project were not fully convinced by the political utility of these categories. Just in that regard, much has changed in the intervening years. In 2019, for example, a group of Black Italian women penned an open letter to the Corriere della Sera style magazine in response to a racist cover that depicted a young Black girl seated at the feet of Milan's Mayor Beppe Sala. The authors introduced themselves as Donne Nere Italiane, or Black Italian women, and each signed their names with Donna Nera, or Black woman, in place of an institutional affiliation. Even between the time when I finished writing Contesting Race and Citizenship and the English version being available for purchase in 2022, new activist figures, debates, mobilizations, and campaigns had already emerged, from the Cambierai campaign addressing the ubiquity of anti-Black language and imagery on Italy's national public television broadcasting channels, to the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests in Milan and beyond. Indeed, I agonized over when and where to end my book, because each time I finished a draft of the conclusion, it seemed that there was something new to consider. Still, despite the temporal limitations of this text, I hope that it continues to have usefulness as an archive, as an account of a conjunctural moment when a new generation of Black Italian activists emerged in the midst of a rising tide of xenophobic nationalism to challenge the anti-Black racism and coloniality at the heart of the Italian project, a time capsule of sorts. Yet, in another sense, in a deeply infuriating sense, the book is evergreen. So right now I'm working with an Italian press to release an Italian translation of the book next year. And just as a side note, ensuring that my research on the politics of racism and race in Italy is readily accessible in Italian for academic and non-Italian audiences remains central to my research ethics and practice. The book is going to be translated by Marie Moisset, who's in the center of this slide. She is an Italian Haitian scholar whose other translations include Women, Race, and Class and Blues, Legacies, and Black Feminism by Angela Davis. And then Angelica Pezzarini, who is on the right, and Marilena Deli Umoza, who is on the left, will be writing an afterword and a preface. Black women have played a central role in anti-racist and decolonial activism in Italy. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to foreground Black women's voices through this translation. As part of the translation process, I had to return to the book to write a new introduction back in September of this year. So, as many of you may know, the Italian government collapsed in the summer of 2020 after the prime minister and the president dissolved the Italian parliament when various political parties withdrew their support from a national unity government. The resulting September 25th snap elections culminated in the victory of a center-right coalition led by Giorgia Meloni, who is widely considered the most far-right Italian head of state since Benito Mussolini, who Meloni has praised as a great leader. And it's worth noting that Meloni actually also cut her teeth as an activist in the Movimento Sociale Italiano, which is a political party that was formed as a direct successor when the Italian Fascist Party was outlawed. So the government collapse also took with it the most recent attempt at a reform of Italian citizenship law. So this proposal, known as Ius Scholae, would have provided a path to citizenship for the children of immigrants who were born or raised, or who were born in Italy or arrived before the age of 12, have legal residence, and passed at least 5 years of schooling in Italy. And while this proposal would have been an important step toward expanding citizenship rights, Ius Scholae also resurfaced challenging questions about the possibilities and limits of citizenship, similar to the ones that I traced in my book. So the political party that was championing the Ius Scholae proposal developed campaign posters with the slogan, "Chi studia in Italia è italiano, Ius Scholae per I bambini che vanno a scuola con I nostri figli." This translates to, "Whoever studies in Italy is Italian. Ius Scholae for the children who go to school with our kids." So 2 things about this slogan. One, it's a notable departure from earlier slogans like "Chi nasce in Italia è italiano," or "Whoever is born in Italy is Italian." So it's changed from "Whoever is born in Italy" to "Whoever studies in Italy is Italian," which raises the question of why citizenship should be earned through schooling. And the second issue is the "our" in the phrase "Ius Scholae for the children who go to school with our children," right? Who is the "our" in our children? What notions of Italianness are being reproduced through this new formulation of citizenship? And Black people in Italy continue to face deadly violence. Willie Montero, a 21-year-old Cape Verdean Italian, was beaten to death by a group of white men in Rome in 2020 while coming to the defense of a friend. Alika Ogorchukwu, a disabled Nigerian street vendor, was beaten to death by a white man in Civitanova Marche in 2020 in front of a crowd of bystanders who did nothing to intervene on his behalf. And lest we succumb to the myth that police and carceral violence are merely American problems, numerous cases of racial profiling and brutality at the hands of Italian police have circulated across traditional and social media in just the past several months. Most famously, the case of professional footballer Timoye Bakayoko. These stories do not even begin to exhaust the toll of physical violence and death unleashed on Black people in Italy during just the past 2 years. These stories are not aberrations. As Wisal Hubabi and Marie Moise argue, there is nothing exceptional about the murder of Alika Ogorchukwu in a country where more than 40 racist murders were committed in the last 40 years, not counting the survivors of supremacist attacks, beatings in prisons, in the Centri di Permanenza per il Rimpatrio, or in places like the Levante police station in Piacenza. And yet, my book was never meant to be solely an inventory of Black suffering and death. As Robin D.G. Kelly reminds us, reducing Black people to mere fungible and violated bodies only reproduces our dehumanization. It ignores the ways we have continued to create communities, forge new cultural forms, engage in radical resistance and struggle, and dream more free and just worlds, all in the face of enslavement, colonialism, racist aggression, and border violence. We must acknowledge the ongoing apocalypse of Black oppression, honor and struggle in the names of those we have lost, and hold tight to the insight that Blackness has always exceeded suffering and violence. And in fact, I believe that we are in a time of incredible possibility. This might seem like a case of naivete of the will in the face of pessimism of the intellect, in a conjuncture characterized by a global resurgence of fascism and racism, the brutal fortification of borders, the intensification of economic inequality and precarization. This decade is often referred to as a crisis, as a Gramscian interregnum in which an existing social formation is crumbling, but a new one has yet to take shape. Yet abolitionist geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore argues, drawing on Stuart Hall, the crisis is not objectively bad or good, rather it signals systemic change whose outcome is determined through struggle. In other words, the outcome of this moment of global crisis is neither fixed nor predetermined, and we have the opportunity to prefigure a better world out of the ashes of the old. And in that sense, what is happening in Italy has far-reaching implications. Black Italian struggles for racial justice are crucial for understanding how to resist the forces of racial capitalist nationalism that are shaping our world today, underscoring the necessity of forging interconnections among diverse struggles for justice. And just to conclude a little bit about what I'm doing next. So I'm working on two new book projects. The first is an edited volume called The Black Geographic Praxis, Resistance, Futurity, which I'm editing with my colleague Jovan Scott Lewis at UC Berkeley. And this grew out of a symposium that we organized back in 2017. And the book explores Black struggles for liberation across a wide range of historical and geographical terrains, such as urban displacement, environmental degradation, and border fortification, and it's slated to come out next fall. I'm also laying the groundwork for a new project tentatively called Black Mediterranean Geographies of Abolition, which considers the connections between Black liberation struggles in the United States focused on policing and prisons, and Black liberation struggles in Italy focused on access to citizenship and the dismantling of deadly border fortification. I developed the conceptual scaffolding for this project through a series of collaborative writing projects with my longtime collaborator, Angelica Pizzarini, on Black Lives Matter in Italy for Jacobin Italia and Public Books. And my goal with this new project is to tell an interconnected global story about anti-racism mobilizations across the Black Mediterranean and Atlantic diasporas that are connected by technologies of displacement, as well as creative strategies of resistance and world building. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Professor Hawthorne, for sharing that very remarkable book. That's this timely monograph, I believe, and also sharing your background, which really kind of complements your work so much. I think this book is timely because it really puts to the surface the invisibility of Black people raised in the diaspora, the intersections of citizenship, and some of the ways that activists are confronting this huge racial landscape that is intertwined with the possibility and naivety, as you've put it. Can I ask Alison to offer her engagement before we have a Q&A?
Sure, thanks so much, Mimi, and thank you so much, Professor Hawthorne, for your book and for your really wonderful sharing. I really echo what Mimi was saying, that it was so nice to have the faces of your parents, even having read about them in your book, to have a visual kind of an image to bring all those stories together. So really, I think this text is, I personally really enjoyed reading it, and I think that this text about citizenship is really key to the themes that we've been talking about at HUMA, that deal with what it means to be human, and in the process of unpacking citizenship and what it does, it really looks at the importance of citizenship also as a proxy for what it means to be recognized as a human. So I have different kind of questions and threads that I picked up on that I would love to hear Professor Hawthorne kind of discuss and elaborate on further. Is that okay, Mimi and Professor Hawthorne?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, great. So my first kind of thought was really around, I love that you, in the book and also in your patient, that you talk about the potential for different discourses, and the potential that these different discourses can have in reimagining the way that we think about race and citizenship. And I was curious about how would kind of North American and Black European studies on race and citizenship be put into conversation with studies from South Africa and from Southern Africa, where the racial dimensions of citizenship were also very prominent, both during apartheid and also in the formation of the nation state as it is right now. I'm not sure, Dr. Hawthorne, if you'd like to respond to that, or if
I'm so sorry. I'm trying for. I think I'm still having issues with my connection here because of the weather, which is why I was hoping that with the transcript I'd be able to see a little bit more. But could you maybe I'm so sorry. Could you type the question in the chat? I just want to make sure that I'm responding correctly, but I'm catching just pieces.
Sure. Sure, I can do that. And maybe I'm not sure. Maybe Mimi or someone else who can hear me would be able to type it. Maybe I'll just
or maybe so that Allison can keep talking. If maybe someone else could type it in the chat.
I could type the
Thank
questions
you so
for
much.
you. I could type those questions for you. Yeah, thank you.
Sure, thank you, and thanks for your understanding, Prof, as well. We're also dealing with our own connection struggles with load shedding here in South Africa, so might not actually be on your side. It might be on all of our side as well. So my second question was really around kind of, so in your text you really engaged with the everyday negotiations of citizenship, and this concept of citizenship is continuously in motion. And I particularly love the phrase that the ways that such a vivid word to describe kind of different discourses and practices of citizenship. And I know kind of your fifth chapter deals with alternative forms of organizing that don't necessarily regard state granted citizenship as kind of the ultimate or primary goal. And so I was curious about how your text would consider that coming from, and I'm pointing specifically to the work of Professor Francis Nyamjo, that also regards citizenship as, but through binding relationships and social action. And so I was curious about whether and how these types of collective, group, and community to the lived experiences of citizenship for the participants in your research. And finally, the kind of the third thought that I had as I was reading this text was really around kind of the hopeful and imaginative nature of the book. And I think that also is captured in your presentation, the need to reimagine debates on citizenship and race and envision how these debates could be different. And so I think your text really provokes readers to imagine across borders in articulating alternative solidarities. And I think you talked about how there's a need to subvert these categories of citizen, migrant, and refugee. And I was curious kind of the potential for alternative solidarities with on somewhat of a regional, continental, or within the African context or continent that we are situated in, and what might alternative solidarities between kind of citizens, waiting migrants, refugees, and continents. So those are my three. I think I'll pause there, and I know Mimi is typing them out furiously as we go, but also happy to clarify any of the prompts or questions. But yeah, so over to you, kind of Professor Hawthorne.
Thank you. I'm trying to follow along as much as I can, and I think I have a sense of the questions, but I'm waiting for, yeah, I'm just waiting for them to get transcribed into the chat. Yeah.
Alison, your connection unfortunately is not very good. I did not manage to get the full questions as you were breaking. So I just typed what I could hear from my end. I'm not sure if that's any helpful for anyone at this point, but yeah.
Okay.
But I see there's someone, there's a hand in the.
Why don't I type and then.
Sorry, you said?
Why don't you go to Nabil and then I will type my question.
Okay, please. Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you so much. Nabil, I hope we can hear you very well. Please go ahead with your question.
Hello, Camilla. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot for this really amazing work. It's very inspiring and eye-opening, really, working on questions of racism and geographies. It's a much needed scholarship taking a very critical edge, and it has this abolitionist edge that Ruth Wilson Gilmore talked about in her abolition geographies. It resonates very well with her work, and I must own it. Like Italian scholars are really the leading ones when it comes to migration activism. Really, whenever I read a migration scholar working on activism, solidarity, and how they intersect with questions of race and blackness, you find really so many Italian scholars are in the forefront. It's really I'm also working in the Mediterranean as well, on borders and migration and border death, and it's very inspiring when you mentioned the boat capsizer, the infamous one of the 13th of October 2013, and how it led to the rise of solidarity regimes of the state, this kind of grief and commemoration and their own significance, and how they can be juxtaposed with counter solidarities, transformative or transforming solidarities that are migrant led, or they are led by scholars, activists. My question is, it's more than a comment, a reflection than a question. Like how now that was when in a more democratic Europe, but now with the rise of this right wing in Italy and further afield in Europe, how could this transform questions of abolitionism of the space, like how abolitionism or liberation should be taken, as Wilson talked about, from the liberation of prisoners to the liberation of a space. Like how can migrants now, Black migrants, claim a space within Europe, and how it would take place? And here I would quote Paul Gilroy when he talked about agnostic belonging of post-colonial Africans in Europe. Like what are the stakes? Do we have to seek inclusion, or we have to go for an agnostic belonging against all those forms of exclusionary forms and the obscene of exclusion that Genova talked about in relation to the border spectacle that's taking place, like especially Lampedusa. Lampedusa is a very is the hub of these border spectacles as a touristic hub. At the same time, it's a place where there is an outpouring of boatloads of people coming to invade the Italian island.
Okay, so once again, I caught pieces, but if I could ask you to type that, maybe if you could type that into the chat, and then I'll circle back to Allison's questions, and then I'll come back to your question. I just want to make sure that I'm doing it justice, because I caught pieces, and it's really, your question is really fascinating. So thank you, Allison, for putting these in the chat. So how would North American and Black European studies on race and citizenship be put into conversation with? Yeah, so, one of the things that I sort of kept coming back to as I was thinking about citizenship, and I also emphasize this a lot with my students when I teach classes on racial capitalism, is the theoretical, the political, obviously political, but also theoretical centrality of South Africa for this entire genealogy of thinking about race and racial capitalism on a global scale, right? So, Cedric Robinson first encounters the term racial capitalism when he's studying in the UK, when he is speaking, right, with Marxist political economists who are trying to make sense of capitalism in the context of apartheid. And then he sort of goes from looking at racial capitalism as the description of a specific system in a specific place and time to racial capitalism being a feature of capitalism, right, since its origin. And similarly, right, Stuart Hall comes to his understanding of, articulation by engaging with the race class debates in South Africa. And David Thiel Goldberg as well, comes to his understanding of the racial state by thinking about South Africa. And so, I appreciate you, right, sort of recentering the kind of global political significance of South Africa for the way that we think about the entanglements of racism and capitalism. And I would say that, I draw a lot from David Thiel Goldberg when he sort of encourages us to think about a spectrum of racial states. He says that when we talk about the racial state, in sort of colloquial or sort of in everyday conversation, there's an assumption that to say that the state is racial, right, means that you're talking about Nazi Germany or apartheid South Africa, right? But that actually, right, what are considered these kind of extreme cases, right, are actually extreme cases of and mutual imbrication of race and the workings of the modern state that actually go to the heart of the state and the liberal project itself, that they're not aberrations. And so I found that sort of really useful in shaping my own thinking, right? That in the case of Italy, right, there's a tendency to, say that racism sort of comes on the scene during a particular moment in the fascist period when Mussolini was influenced by Hitler. And so racism gets linked to fascism in a particular way that sort of exceptionalizes it. And what I'm interested in doing is thinking about the connection, right, between liberalism and capitalism and the racial state. And again, I think South Africa also gives us tools for thinking about that as well. Let's see, to your second question, let's see, yeah. Miamno argues that citizens are not citizens in abstraction, but citizens through binding relationships and social actions. Yeah, so this is an interesting question about sort of how we define citizens and citizenship. And this is where I found myself kind of grappling with all of these different perspectives on citizenship, right? So I kind of mentioned that you have the liberal kind of sociology of citizenship, which is like, citizenship is like this contract between, the citizen and the state, right, where you are given protections and protections like physical protection and the protection of your rights in exchange for you, right, offering you having certain responsibilities as a citizen. And then this critical citizenship studies literature, which I think really importantly points to the fact that there are all sorts of ways that people who are not formally recognized as citizens by the state still engage in acts of citizenship, right? So citizenship is like a thing that you do. It's not like a stable thing, but it's a thing that you do and it's a thing that you enact. And that there are all sorts of different ways that migrant communities, marginalized communities engage in acts of citizenship or insurgent citizenship without formal recognition for the state. And one of the things that I sort of struggled with in writing this book was both understanding how to acknowledge and how to acknowledge all the ways that people who are barred from citizenship are enacting citizenship, but also recognizing that it still matters to not have state citizenship, right? Like, it's like, how do we not romanticize insurgent citizenship to the point where we actually downplay the material significance of having that formal citizenship from the state? And I say this not because I am idealizing the state, but rather because I understand that the state still has a monopoly, right? A state still has this sort of hegemonic power over the conferral of rights and protections, right? This is kind of the Arendtian dilemma of the right to have rights. So how do we both acknowledge that there are forms of citizenship and engagement that exceed the state, but also that it still materially matters to not have access to citizenship, right? Because it means that you're barred from employment opportunities, your ability to, you're not able to vote, you're not able to travel in particular ways. So that's always been kind of a dilemma that runs through the book. And I think it was kind of summarized really brilliantly by one of my colleagues who said something like, you know, we both want everyone to have citizenship, and we also want a world where citizenship doesn't matter anymore, right? Citizenship granted by the state. Because, right, as you know, you're acknowledging in this question, there are so many other ways in which people enact citizenship, and in which people enact their ethical and political responsibilities to each other beyond the kind of boundaries of formal nation state recognition. And then let's see, the question of alternative solidarities. What might alternative solidarities look like on the African continent? So, you know, I think, you know, an example, yeah, what might this look like on the African continent? I think, you know, some great examples of these are the sorts of kind of underground railroad inspired projects that are sort of aimed at using kind of covert strategies to help people migrate safely from, you know, from the African continent across the Mediterranean into Europe. And then once they're in Europe, to make their way safely across Europe. I think there's a sort of tricky question here, because sometimes the answer to that question, people will say, you know, it's promoting, say, economic development and opportunity on the African continent so that people don't have to migrate in the first place. My skepticism with that claim is that that's sort of what the European Union claims that it's trying to do, right? To basically stop Black people from getting into Europe at all. And sort of my thing is, anyone who wants to migrate should be able to migrate and should have the ability to do that safely. And it's the increasing fortification of borders that makes migration unsafe, right? That border violence is a result of policy and particular kinds of government intervention. And so I think some of the most powerful solidarities are the sorts of what Maurice Steele calls these sort of underground railroads that help to facilitate migration in the face of state restriction. Okay, so now to Nabil, the future of migrant solidarities in Europe in the wake of the rising political influence of the right wing. So I think one of the big ones, Nabil, and you know, I sort of started seeing this even earlier, but I think it's going to become even more important, is that in the kind of earlier days of the citizenship reform movement, there was a kind of reluctance to link citizenship struggles to the struggles of migrants and refugees. And part of that had to do with you know, the kind of framing power of the racial state discourse, right, in which the children of African immigrants who were born and raised in Italy were perpetually framed as migrants and outsiders. And so in order to articulate claims to citizenship, they had to actively distance themselves from migrants and refugees, even though they acknowledged, right, that their fates were fundamentally intertwined. And I've noticed increasingly a kind of resistance to these strategies of division, saying that, there might be power differentials, our lived experiences might be different, but there are also ways in which our fates are bound together, that we are all made vulnerable to state violence because of our Blackness in ways that often transcend access to citizenship. So I think that's going to become even more important. We saw this during the 2020 Black Lives Matter mobilizations in Italy that were focused on citizenship, but also on Fortress Europe, and also on the labor exploitation of undocumented African migrants in Italian agriculture. Let's see, political implications of post-mortem citizenship. Well, I mean, I think that the sort of biggest implication is that it continues to perpetuate the myth of European beneficence, right? We've extended citizenship to these migrants, to these poor migrants who died, and it deflects responsibility for those deaths, right? That European nation states and Frontex are directly responsible for those deaths in the first place. But the extension of posthumous citizenship sort of allows for a deflection of responsibility for those deaths by sort of upholding the myth of Europe as a place of enlightenment and liberalism. Let's see, can we say that the rise of the right wing will give us a clear-cut vision or liberation possibilities beyond the Janus face of European democracy? I think that, I mean, let's put it this way. I'm not an accelerationist, right? I don't believe that like what we need is, a Trump or a Meloni in order to kind of force the system into crisis and bring about systemic change, because, like a lot of people die in the process, right? That's the problem with the kind of accelerationist with accelerationist politics. But I do think that if there is anything remotely positive that has happened since Meloni's election, is that it has renewed conversations about the legacies of fascism in Italy. Italy really never had a kind of concerted post-fascist reckoning. Scholars of Black Germany have noted that, even in Germany, the kind of reckoning with the extensive violence of fascism and the colonial roots of the Holocaust were never really taken seriously. But compared to Italy, right, Germany had something of a substantive national reckoning with the violence of fascism. And in Italy, that never really happened. So many Italians don't really know the extent to which Italian fascism was rooted in state racism. They don't have a good understanding of kind of the extent and violence of Italian imperialism on the African continent. And I do think that since the election of Meloni, there has been a kind of outpouring of work by activists and scholars who are really pointing to the continuity of past and present in a way that has not happened before. And I think that that's really significant, right? Not too long ago, we had a major anniversary of the Italian fascist statement on race, and Meloni came to power not long after the 100th anniversary of Mussolini's March on Rome, right? So a lot of things kind of converged for this really important national and international reckoning about the reverberations of Italian fascism and imperialism. Yeah, sedentarism, absolutely, Nabil, so important. That notion of kind of sedentarist logics, the sort of naturalization of, people as inherently in stasis and rooted in place. So, anyone who is a mobile subject is kind of cast as pathological is a really important analytic in my work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Hawthorne, for engaging with those questions. Not sure if anyone else has a reflection or a question. Alison, let me know if there's something else you have to say. I myself don't have a question. It's just a matter of still reading your text, still really better understanding the complexity of such citizenship, of such invisibility. And I think I appreciate your work alongside my colleague Nabil, who writes about hauntology and border hauntology and how we might think about it. So that's just something I can say that I appreciate. Thank you for sharing your email, to which we can send further questions to. Is there anything else anyone would like to say before we've actually gone 15 minutes over time, but that's fine.
Thank you for such a lively discussion. I really appreciate all the connections that you've made. So it was, yeah. I've learned a lot just from talking to you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I will just like to close the session by saying thank you to everyone for joining us for our humor seminars. This is our last seminar for the year until we resume our seminars next year. We have a range of seminar series such as the Humor Interdisciplinary Series. This is the Humor Book Launch Series. We have the Attire Series. And we also have had some disobedience workshops for the humor colleagues, which will continue next year. So please check out our website. Our Twitter handle is @humor_Africa. And thank you so much, Professor Hawthorne, for sharing your book, which is available. It's an open access book available on the Cornell University Press website. Without further ado, thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.